From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Wednesday, September 20. A number of Pacific Island nations, which sit right on our doorstep, are dangerously close to slipping into the oceans as they continue to rise. In response, a number of their governments issued a proposal last week to Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong. They want their citizens to enjoy visa-free travel to and from Australia and New Zealand. But how much support do these nations have from us? Today, political and international editor Peter Hartcher on who's standing in the way of helping these nations and what we will lose if we don't. So, Peter, just how close are these Pacific nations to disappearing?
Well, some of them have already started to disappear. Among the small Pacific Island states, the Solomon Islands, I think, was the first where it was documented that 5 of their islands had disappeared permanently underwater, and that was 7 or 8 years ago now. They weren't huge islands. They were between sort of 1 and 5 hectares, but they were there for hundreds of years, and now they're not. The 3 front-line states that are suffering some symptoms already and will suffer the first disappearances are Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands. All of those are Pacific atoll, essentially strips of sand built on coral in the middle of the mighty Pacific. The total population of those 3 countries, by the way, is less than 200,000. So we're not talking about huge populations, we're talking about small islands, and we're talking about them disappearing. And then after that, the next most vulnerable are the Solomons, which has a bigger population, nearly 750,000, where, as I say, 5 of their islands have been lost already to permanent inundation. Palau is another one that's in the front line, and then Vanuatu and Fiji aren't going to disappear, but they are savagely affected by storms, king tides, plus the cyclones that are increasingly associated with climate change.
Global sea levels continue to rise at an unprecedented rate.
Because of rising sea levels caused by global warming.
Some islands are already disappearing under the rising seawater.
80 villagers are facing the painful decision of whether to leave behind their homes and relocate.
So you put it all together, there's a lot of pain and suffering and anxiety that's already begun. Kiribati has launched a national strategy called Migration with Dignity, which is essentially planning to relocate most of the 130,000 people of Kiribati elsewhere, to evacuate them elsewhere on the planet, somewhere, with dignity. And Tuvalu's foreign minister was the one who 2 years ago at the Glasgow Climate Summit recorded himself speaking to the delegates from a lectern with seawater lapping around his thighs, and his speech included the line, "We are sinking."
We are sinking, but so is everyone else. And no matter if we feel the impacts today, like in Tuvalu, or in 100 years...
Tuvalu's started a project to upload an exact replica of its islands into the metaverse, in the expectation that that'll be the only place it exists eventually. So these are some of the coping mechanisms countries are trying to come up with, but they're not solutions.
I mean, it definitely gives you pause when you think of a nation having a motto, migration with dignity. It sort of is quite sobering. Do you think the suffering of these people has been on our radar, that is the radar of either ordinary Australians or our politicians?
It definitely has not. Occasionally it'll come into view, like when Tuvalu's foreign minister did the broadcast to the Glasgow Climate Summit, but in general it's very far from our minds. We'll think about maybe a Fiji holiday, but that's as far as it goes. And unless you're confronted with direct evidence, which very few Australians are, then it seems like an abstract. And it was only a few years ago that Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison were caught laughing on camera, making fun of the prospect of these islands disappearing under the waves.
The time doesn't mean anything when you're about to be, have water lapping at your doors.
So they certainly haven't got enough attention, and they really feel that. And the expectation is that those first 3 countries, Kiribati, Tuvalu and the Marshall Islands, will be gone by 2070 at the current rate of global warming, just gone.
Wow. And so that brings us to your column this week, which is about how push is coming to shove. The governments of a large grouping of Pacific Island nations put a new suggestion to our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, in Fiji on Friday. So what have they proposed?
They proposed that Australia and New Zealand should allow visa-free travel to all Pacific Island Forum states. So there are 18 of those countries in the Pacific Islands Forum. They call it the Pacific Family. It includes Australia and New Zealand. Significantly, it doesn't include the US or China and Papua New Guinea, but the rest of them are small Pacific states. And they're all asking that Australia and New Zealand grant visa-free access. That's the proposal. Already, New Zealand allows half a dozen countries some limited visa-free access. So Cook Islands, for example, people can just turn up in New Zealand. But what these islanders wanted was a systemic opening of our borders, essentially, to the other 16 members of the Pacific Island Forum.
And so how did Penny Wong respond?
Diplomatically, she said that would require a lot more work.
Look, obviously that would be a transformative approach to the region, but there is a lot of work to do.
Which is not to rule it out, but certainly not to say we're going to give it to you.
I understand very clearly what the Pacific have said many years ago, which is that climate change is the number one national security issue for this region.
And the practical, realistic response to that, Samantha, is Australia is not going to give them all visa-free access. The unstated reason is that if you give visa-free access, you still need to be able to check to keep criminals and unsavoury characters out of your country. And the Australian officialdom does not have confidence in the criminal record keeping or necessarily the honesty of the officials in some of these countries, who would then be making the representations about who's a criminal and who's not. And so therefore, without that confidence, they're not going to give visa-free access.
Have increased our labour mobility scheme places, which allow people to come to Australia for work, and which has obviously benefited Australia.
But Australia is trying to put in place the next best thing, which is giving Pacific Islanders the right to settle permanently in Australia. This is new. The Albanese government took it to the last election. They created a new visa class called Pacific Engagement Visa. And the Pacific Engagement Visa would initially at least be given to 3,000 Pacific Island people a year. They could move to Australia, and provided they can get work, they have to show that they can get a job, then they're allowed to settle here permanently. And that is actually about, at first it's as good as it gets, but second, it's a pretty good consolation prize.
Okay, and you've written that this is a hugely important strategic step for Australia, not just the visas that you've just mentioned, but possibly even this sort of visa-free travel from the Pacific Island nations and Australia, New Zealand. So why would this be so important strategically?
So something like that. So if Australia can successfully implement those Pacific engagement visas and presumably over time crank up the numbers from 3,000, what that does is it shows the people of the Pacific Islands, including the ones who are looking at a lifetime where they're going to have to migrate, or their children are going to have to migrate because of climate change, gives them a future, gives them a hope, gives them a promise that there is a place you can go. We already have entitlement to go there. They can start envisaging their lives in Australia. They can start planning lives in Australia, but it's a future, and that's what they lack. And the reason that is such a big strategic advantage is that, remember, we are in a competition for dominance of our own sea lines of communication and our own regional security with China. China has advantages. For example, we know from officials in some of the Pacific Island states that Chinese officials offer them bribes, cash bribes, to change allegiance from Taiwan to China or to do other favours for the Chinese government. The Australian government can't put bribe money into the offshore bank accounts of the Prime Minister of some, or President of some Pacific island. The Chinese have no trouble doing that, can, and will. But what this sort of promising a future through permanent migration to Australia and New Zealand binds their people, to Australia, New Zealand, or in that case the US, in a way that China cannot do, promises and offers a future that China cannot offer, and that is a huge, it's a killer advantage.
Challenges in terms of climate, and also that competition is intensifying in this region. What we see is more activity in different sectors by different nations, including China. But The way through it, I think, is to strengthen regionalism. And one of the...
It doesn't matter if a country's Prime Minister takes the money in the offshore bank account on the sly from a Chinese account. If he wants to please China by doing a deal for them, if your population has got its future and its affections and its hopes invested in another country, let's say it's Australia in this case, or New Zealand, then that trumps the political leader every time because he's still got to win elections.
Except you've written that, of course, we're not in that situation now and that there's a snag to get into this scenario.
There is a snag. The leader of the snag is called Peter Dutton. The snag itself is the coalition, the opposition.
We're disappointed so far that we haven't had support from Mr Dutton. It would be a very important policy for him to support to enable greater engagement between Australia and the region, which matters to us, and the stability of the Pacific matters to us.
So tell us more about the opposition's position on this, Peter, and what their objection is.
Now, the coalition's position is a funny one because they've approved the concept of these visas offering permanent settlement in Australia. They're in favour of that. But they've jacked up at the legislation, which is currently before the Senate and will go to a vote, is scheduled to go to a vote next month. Their objection is to the method of allocating those 3,000 annual places. And the method the government is proposing is a lottery system. And the reason they propose a lottery system is because the Pacific Island states want it. It's the same system that New Zealand uses. It's the same system that the US uses with its green cards. And the reason the Pacific states want it is that if Australia has any other approach, it would be accused of cherry picking or picking the cream of the crop and accelerating a brain drain of the best and brightest out of the Pacific Island states to Australia. And so the Pacific states say, we don't want that. Give us a lottery. It's fair. It's random. That's what they've asked for. But the opposition has called that un-Australian. The opposition has decided to oppose it. The government says it will continue and press ahead, but it needs to get more votes in the Senate to be able to pass the legislation. And
this has led to some heated debate, hasn't it, in Parliament? I believe that the Minister for the Pacific, Pat Conroy, accused the opposition of, well, I can't really use the language that he used, but messing up the Pacific relationship, and he had to withdraw that remark after there was an objection to the sort of language he used.
Messing it up with in extreme terms, yeah, that's right, he did. Yeah, because the government thinks that it's just obstructionism for obstructionism's sake. So they're very frustrated. But they haven't yet got the numbers for the legislation in the Senate, but they're fairly confident that they can. The other point that frustrates Labor is that the Liberals have banged on so much about national security. And let's give them some credit. In some areas, they did an extremely good job with national security and defence. And Scott Morrison was the one who came up with the Pacific Step-Up policy, which did have some extra benefits for Pacific Islands. So let's be fair to the Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. But on this one, the government says, well, you talk all this stuff about security, but when you've got an actual opportunity to really cement a sphere of influence, this is what it would be, cementing an Australian sphere of influence in what is otherwise a contested geographic space, you come up with this excuse to oppose it. So the government is very frustrated.
Okay, but what's the chance that we could see Australia and New Zealand work with Pacific Island nations to create something that serves everyone's interests?
Yes, I think conceptually it's already underway. I think the Pacific Islands Forum creates a ready-made organisation, structure, body on which to build. The Pacific Island Forum countries are all in favour of more integration, and there are a range of areas where it could apply above and beyond migration, but migration obviously is central to it. And by the way, the population of all the 15 countries in the Pacific Islands Forum who are vulnerable to climate change, including having their countries disappear, the whole population is only 3 million. So we're talking about a small number of people, and Australia has no trouble taking a couple of 100,000 new permanent immigrants a year. So over the course of a couple of decades, you can see this is a digestible lump, potentially. But it's beyond immigration. So, for example, telecommunications is another area ripe for integration. And there are lots of other areas where you could apply it as well. And the director of research at the Lowy Institute, Hervé Lemaiu, he just says that, the European Union wasn't created in a day. It started with an iron and steel agreement. Why not start a telecommunications agreement as the basis for the first step in economic integration of the Pacific Island states? It's an idea whose time has come. The states have a shared interest in this happening. There will be external resistance. It's just last year that Beijing sent its officials to try and sign a security agreement with 10 Pacific Island countries all at once, and it was rejected. But the Chinese aren't going to give up. And Hervé calls it, for Australia to play the current game, whack-a-mole, that, you'll deal with a Chinese advance in one place in one realm, and then the next day there'll be another in another realm, and that Beijing isn't going to walk away from this competition. This is a long-term strategy. So to take the whack-a-mole element out and make it systematic, he says, and I think it's the sensible course, integrate. And both Labor and Liberal here are on board with the concept, if not necessarily the details of the execution, as we've discussed.
So we could still become what you put so lovely, in such a lovely way, as a continent-sized lifeboat for these people in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's right. And if you're living on a small island that is shrinking year by year, and where the storm surges get bigger and bigger, where ancestors' bones are now floating out of graveyards during high tide, where the seawater is penetrating what little soil there is, so you can no longer grow the vegetables that have been grown there for centuries, then the prospect of a continent-size lifeboat is very appealing.
Thank you, Peter, as always.
Pleasure, Samantha.
For joining us. Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.